Hello, and welcome. This is Congruent with Cass the Coup and me, Still the Human. Let's talk about Israel. Now, we've covered the history of the region of Palestine in a previous video. If you want to know the not really relevant history, click here to catch up. As I've said before, though, the history of the region doesn't matter in current relations between Israel and Palestine. Israel has used a heavily US-backed military budget to bully their way through the region to secure illegal land grabs and oppress Palestinians. We're going to state up front, there isn't any issue with a Jewish population living in the lands where their ancestors thrived. The Jewish people living in what should be Palestine are not the problem. The issue, and it's a really big issue, is the state of Israel and the establishment of an apartheid state that commits acts against humanity on a regular basis. A disgusting establishment built to oppress a specific group of people and commit acts of genocide against them. That's the real issue with Israel. Hey Cass, did you know that in 1945 the United Nations created a charter to help guide the world forward, coming off the back end of 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century? Now, there are 193 sovereign states that are members that make up this United Nations, but the international recognition of Israel is only agreed upon by 164 of them. And the ones that don't agree, most of them are in the Middle East and in North Africa. It's a weird thing, right? I wonder why that would be. Maybe it's because of their strong-arm tactics to fight their way into existence, backed by the West, allowing them to legally take lands. That's the second time that's been brought up. So, what am I saying? Israel has made illegal annexations of land from Palestinians, and are continuing to do so in the West Bank. Also, since the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel has occupied the Golan Heights of Syria. They've taken and continue to hold land illegally over the years. Back to the United Nations. They are important because of the charter that was established in 1945. Article 2 says that it is inadmissible for countries to acquire territory by war. What did Israel do in the 1947 war that established their independence? In 1947, the UN proposed a land split between Israel and Palestine that would give 51% of the land to Israel in a really weird and puzzling-looking split, and 49% of the land to Palestine. While this was agreed upon by Israel, it was rejected by the Arab people of the region. This led to a civil war in which, by the end of the fighting in 1949, Israel held almost 80% of the land of mandatory Palestine. That's an illegal land grab through means of war. In 1967, there was the Six-Day War. The result of this war was that Israel once again expanded its territory. They took the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan. They took the Golan Heights from Syria, and they took Sinai and Gaza from Egypt. The Sinai was later reclaimed in another war by Egypt, but that doesn't make the expansion of territory by war something to be ignored. This marks more illegal taking of lands. They agreed upon a settlement area with the United Nations and then expanded that twice through aggression and violence. Another appropriation of land by Israel has occurred in the West Bank. Israel has been building a border wall between the 2 territories, but conveniently for them, they have built the wall within the West Bank territory, claiming more land for Israel as they push their boundaries. Because the West Bank is not a disputed territory, the wall within the West Bank is therefore illegal. This was brought up in 2004 in the International Court of Justice, who ruled that Israel was constructing the barrier illegally and should stop immediately. 14-1 in the ruling. Israel has chosen to ignore this and continue on with their land grab. Aside from those land grabs performed by Israel, they've also gone directly against Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. This states that the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of their own civilian population into the territory it occupies. as well as prohibiting the individual or mass forcible transfers, as well as deportations of protected persons from occupied territory. Not only disregarding the Geneva Convention articles, Israel has been in direct conflict with the Hague Regulations, which prohibit the confiscation of private property. In the occupied Palestinian territory, Israel has displaced local populations as well as settled with its own civilians. They've repeatedly destroyed property and infrastructure used by Palestinians and stolen land for Israel's own settlements. This is all illegal under international law. There are over 100 government-sanctioned settlements in the West Bank and over 100 more that are settlement outposts. And it's not just the West Bank. Palestinians face eviction or home demolition at East Jerusalem. Israeli settlements continue to grow in the Golan Heights. People are being robbed of their land and the resources they use for survival in an ongoing occupation that expands the lands and resources of Israel. This is unjust, disgusting, and illegal. Throughout all of this, over 700 Palestinians have been displaced for the creation of Israel. Refugees, their families, denied the ability to return to their homes, the lands of their families. So when it's Israel seeking land for Jews because of ancestors living there 2,000 years ago, or because they were promised land in their Bible, then it's all okay. But if it's recent history, if it's people wanting to return to their homeland after awful events such as Nakba, then it's to be ignored, disregarded, thrown out. What gives rights to their violence, their land takeovers, and their oppression? Their historic ancestry? Biblical rights have absolutely no standing in the world today, and certainly isn't justification for 70 years of suffocation of the Palestinian people. As Philip Luther has said, there can be no lasting solution to the Palestinian refugee crisis until Israel respects Palestinian refugees' right to return. They have been left stateless in many situations, restricted from healthcare and education. They have overwhelmingly been the victims in all of this. There is no justification. There are only excuses for a far-right state, full of hatred and views of Israel's own supremacy, to continue this displacement and killing of a group they have been oppressing for many years. There have been continued efforts from the Arab nations to resolve a peaceful option with a two-state solution. Israel would go back to its pre-1967 borders and allow Palestinian refugees to return to the lands they were displaced from. This 2002 Arab Peace Initiative has been promoted over the years and is constantly being rejected by Israel. This is an option that would normalize ties between surrounding Arab states and Israel, yet the thought of having Palestinian refugees return to their homeland, that's too much for Israel to bear and accept. Their refusal to come to an agreement with the other nations around them to bear any responsibility for the situations they have created, that inability to admit any fault or wrongdoing of their own, that will make working toward a goal of peace something of dreams. As it is, Israel seems to not harbor any feelings of remorse or regret for their history, but stand proudly on their stolen land saying no to the refugees who want to return home. Palestine has had international recognition as a state since their declaration of independence on the 15th of November, 1988. Furthering that international recognition came in November of 2012 when the UN passed their General Assembly Resolution 67/19. Palestine was upgraded from an observer entity and made a non-member observer state. Yet, Israel and its allies such as the United States refused to acknowledge these. They refused to recognize the statehood of Palestine. 138 of the 193 UN members recognize Palestine. If you recall, that's almost as many that recognize Israel. It's probably easier to ignore any efforts to see them as an official state when your goals are to extinguish them, though, right? Let's justify the use of language to label Israel as an apartheid state and as a state committing genocide on the Palestinian people. The crime of apartheid is defined under the Rome Statute as inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. While you can say it's not racially based in Israel, they do this against Palestinians based simply on who and who isn't Jewish. This Jewish supremacy has been dictating government and legislation, as well as the military courses of Israel, for as long as it's been around. It doesn't matter where you grew up in the world, if you are Jewish, you are welcome in Israel. Whereas Palestinians are treated as second-class citizens within Israel's borders. And in occupied territories such as the West Bank, they are subject to military law of the IDF, the Israeli Defensive Force, while the Israelis living in the same area operate under civilian rule. Israel has over 60 laws that encourage discriminatory practices against the non-Jews, with the Jewish nation-state law reaching international infamy. As their government shifts more and more towards fascism, the rights of the Israeli Arabs are being eroded. Not just their legal rights, though. Israel has deprived Palestinians of fundamental human rights. They have denied their right to freedom of movement, and they have pushed this towards genocide. Raphael Lemkin defined the term genocide in 1943, and he stated, "Generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions, aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives of such a plan would be the disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups." He went on to say, "The crime of genocide should be recognized therein as a conspiracy to exterminate national, religious, or racial groups. The overt acts of such a conspiracy may consist of attacks against life, liberty, or property of members of such groups merely because of their affiliation with such groups. Since 1948, Israel has killed many Palestinians outright, but they've also displaced huge numbers of their population. Israel has military occupation over their territories and created a state of apartheid that continues to militarily assault Gaza. Hamas, you say, that's the reason. Using violence isn't something to defend or justify, but if we look at the situation at Gaza, we can at least understand how Hamas came to be. That said, the overwhelming majority of deaths between Israel and Hamas militants have been Palestinian civilians. Almost 10 times the amount of Israelis is the count of Palestinian losses. Not only that, but infrastructure in homes, workplaces, schools, hospitals. Israel has had military aid from the United States to the tune of $3 billion yearly since the 1980s, a figure that has risen to $3.8 billion in recent years. Their military budget of $20 billion is one that dwarfs the estimated total spent by Hamas, which is somewhere between $50 and $100 million. A group that's not a military, as Palestine doesn't have a military. The disparity between these two forces is not one to be overlooked. You have Israel with some of the best weapons and military technology in the world against a resistance force smuggling in what they can. Most of the rockets launched by Hamas turn out to be glorified fireworks. However, some are legitimate and deadly. And at times, the explosives used are extracted from Israel's own strikes on Gaza from unexploded munitions. less than 48 hours after Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett took office, airstrikes were conducted on Gaza in response to balloons, causing fires on the border of Gaza and Israel. It's so completely disproportionate. As the late Michael Brooks said on Israel and Palestine, and I quote, "It's not a complex issue. That's the big thing. It's super simple. There's one group that has enormous power. It's the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's backed by the United States. It acts on another population of people with total impunity and is never held accountable for anything. So there's no symmetry in the relationship, period. What matters is what Israel is currently doing to Palestinians, what they have done in recent years in regards to oppression and crimes against humanity. International views, especially from the United States, need to shift to push Israel into working towards a peaceful solution, because as it stands, they will reject any attempt made at peace and continue their genocide on Palestinians. There are steps forward, but when so many people blindly support Israel and any action that they do, it's hard to have hope that anything actually will happen. Thanks for watching this week's episode of Congruent Crew, friends. Stay cute, and bye-bye.